today is a program of both a great spiritual and historical importance. And let me just read from an introduction here. John Dyer, who we're going to see reenacted today. John Dyer was a Methodist circuit rider in the territory of Colorado from 1861 to 1901, a long career on the circuit, so to speak. While he was not well known in the East, his story is every bit as inspiring as that of Francis Asbury or Peter Cartwright. His life and ministry commend many values that can strengthen the ministry of the church and the lives of Christians today. So well regarded was he by his contemporaries that he came to be known as Father John Dyer. I'm going to add this too. If you go to the Colorado State Capitol, there's a stained glass window in this man's honor. Father Dyer is portrayed today by Don Cummings, a retired United Methodist minister. Don is a graduate of Asbury University and Asbury Theological Seminary. He has served churches in Kentucky, Ohio, and Colorado. He and his wife, Bonnie Bailey Cummings, moved to Lexington in 2020 and have enjoyed reconnecting with many former classmates and new Asbury friends. The name of the program today, I love this, if you saw the flyer, A Tenacious Faith in a Topsy-Turvy World. Can I get an amen? How relevant that is today.
So true.
What a message for us to hear today. We are so pleased to welcome to our Wesley Village stage, Father John Dyer.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And as you've already heard, my announced topic, we'll just delve right into it. I was born into a very topsy-turvy world, as you are about to find out. In about 1750, my great-grandfather William came over to America on a ship from England. He was a stowaway, and as soon as he landed in Virginia, he was sold into indentured servanthood until he paid for his fare, his passage across the Atlantic. And after he did that, he actually owned some property in Pendleton County, Virginia. In 1788, my grandfather, I should back up and say that my great-grandfather did not live a very long life. He was killed by Indians before he reached middle age. So by 1788, my grandfather was ready to move the family from Virginia into the pioneer frontier of Kentucky. And they settled within 10 miles, actually within 6 miles of Lexington, and lived there for 10 years. And in 1798, they moved north to Ohio, which had not yet become a state at that point, and settled for a brief time south of Chillicothe, and then moved farther west, just west of Columbus in Franklin County. In 1810, my parents married, and I was born at the junction of the Darbys in Franklin County, Ohio, in 1812. Now, you will remember from your own history that 1812 was a momentous year in American history. There was a war going on. It came officially known as the War of 1812, but many called it the Second American Revolution because we were at war once again with Great Britain. You see, they had been conscripting American citizens to serve in the British Navy, and they were restricting trade to this new nation. That was totally unacceptable to the United States. And so we went back to battle with Great Britain to win the right to control our own seas and our own shipping lanes. And another outcome of that war was it opened up the West for mass migration from the eastern colonies as far as the Mississippi River. My family participated in that great migration to the West, not just once or twice, but 3 times. And I'll tell you more about those migrations in just a moment. 1832 saw the outbreak of the Black Hawk Indian War in Illinois, which is where my family had moved to by that point. After living in Ohio for some time, and I had grown to the age of marrying age, and I did marry. I married a woman named Harriet Foster, And we took our family and moved to Illinois because the farmland in Ohio at that point was becoming too restricted. You had to put fences around farmland, and we were just running out of farmland, if you can believe that, in 1812 or 18, whatever year it was, 18, in the 50s, whatever else. And so we moved to Illinois because there were great open pasture lands in Illinois, and it promised a better living. Unfortunately, when we got there, the farming economy crashed, and many people lost their shirts. You could not get a fair price for anything that you raised on the farm. And to add to that despair, my wife just suddenly died. By that point, we'd had 5 children. The last was a little baby born just 14 months before my wife died, and 14 months after she died, our baby died. So I was left a widow with 4 children, with a career or a job that was very low paying, and it was a very difficult time in my life. So I decided it was time to move farther west, and we moved from Illinois to Wisconsin, where I became involved in lead mining. It was a more secure income, more predictable, and more generous than farming was. And I spent the rest of my life as a miner, first mining lead in Wisconsin, and then later on in Minnesota, and then in Colorado, I mined not lead, but gold from time to time. In 1830, I began to seek a salvation of my soul at a camp meeting in Madison County, Ohio. I described the topsy-turvy world into which I was born, and I was fortunate, even at a very young age, to begin to receive a tenacious faith. I like that word, tenacious. It means grab hold of and never let go. And I never let go of my faith, and my faith never let go of me. It was a strong two-way street. And in 1830, at this camp meeting I just mentioned, I began to be awakened spiritually. At that point, I was 12 years old. And I began to seek salvation, and I went to the altar, and I was seeking the Lord's blessing on my life, and I decided to join the church. Now, in my day, when you joined the Methodist Church, it was a lengthy process, because you were accepted, first of all, as a member on probation. And during your probation period, you had to attend weekly class meetings. That was a real stalwart part of early Methodism. I resisted going to the class meetings because I felt like they were kind of intrusive. What are all these people doing poking around in my life? But the class leader got me aside one day and explained to me what the class meetings were attempting to do. That they were trying to care for one another. They were trying to hold each other accountable for our Christian faith and our Christian commitment in life. And after that, I came to class meetings with greater ease. And after a year or so of fulfilling my responsibilities to attend the class meetings faithfully, I was able and ready to become a full member of the Methodist Church. Early on, I was recognized as someone who had some gifts for speaking. I don't know where they came from. I wasn't comfortable with it. But I was pressed into service as a Methodist exhorter. Not a preacher, but an exhorter. Do you know the difference? I see some nodding heads. A preacher was commissioned and authorized to announce a text, read the text, and preach from the biblical text. Exhorters were not authorized to preach from the Bible. They could not announce a text, they could not read a text. They were only allowed to exhort the believers, to encourage them in their faith, to hold them accountable for their attendance at class meetings and their faithfulness and following the vows of church membership and those kinds of things. So there was kind of a dividing line between exhorters and preachers. But becoming an exhorter was often understood as a first step on the path toward becoming an ordained traveling preacher, which I did become in time. Peter Cartwright's a name that's well known in Kentucky and in Illinois, which was the main foci of his ministry. And Peter Cartwright signed my license as an exhorter. So we had some minimal contact at least, and I was very much aware of his ministry and his courageousness and his tenaciousness as he preached the gospel and met with all kinds of opposition and beat them down, sometimes literally beating them down. Well, in 1831, as I mentioned, my family moved to Ohio, and my commitment to Christ began, and my call to ministry began to take shape. And in those early years, I did feel kind of a nascent call into the ministry. But I was young, and I had just married, and I wasn't ready to answer that call yet. I struggled with it for many years. It was actually about 25 years between the time I committed my life to Christ and the time that I finally succumbed to the Lord's call on my life to become a minister. 1832 was an year in which I determined to seek all that God had in store for me through Christ's all-cleansing blood. And that was a bit of a struggle, but I really broke through. I prayed at the altar till I got victory. But then immediately in the following year, I was faced with sore temptations. I was young. I liked to go with guys who liked to be young and do the kinds of things that young men do. But the Lord convicted me as I was riding my horse to one of these outings against participating in their kind of licentious behavior. And so I stopped heading towards that party and returned home and began an internal spiritual struggle as to just how much of my life was I really willing to give to the Lord. Well, that kind of came to a head one day as I was praying in the woods. I'd just been studying the book of Job and reading about all the trouble that the Lord put Job through. Terrible things. And I thought, Lord, I don't want to go through all those kinds of things. I'd rather you take me now and spare me all the kinds of trouble that Job experienced. And the Lord said to me, John, you're not done yet. I have things for you to do for me. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Now, there is no clearer call to preach than that, but still I wasn't ready to go. I had 4 children by this point. I had just lost my wife at this point. I had to support them. My oldest was already in college. I wanted to be able to send the other 3 to college, to university, to get a higher education, which I was never able to get. And so I just kept putting the Lord off. Well, there was a time when I was having another great spiritual awakening and struggle. And there was a pastor named Pastor Snow, who made it a point to encourage exhorters on their way up to becoming ordained traveling preachers to preach at his church once a month. When it came time for me to preach, I went, I read my text. By this time I was allowed to do that. And after I read my text, I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Not a single word. It was as if I had been struck dumb. I turned to the Pastor Snow and I said, Pastor, you better preach. And he said, no, Brother John, you go ahead. Give it another try. So I tried it again. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I said to Pastor Snow, I quit. And I went and sat down. Well, he said a few things to kind of smooth this over. He didn't preach anything, but he dismissed the crowd, and somehow revival had broken out. I don't know how that happened, but he asked me back the next weekend to preach, and 300 people showed up. I couldn't figure it out. So I got back up in front of them and said, now some of you were here last week and you know what happened. But I've really struggled this past week and I've decided that I still have some preach left in me. And so I was able to preach and my sermon came with ease and power and revival struck. The altar was filled, responses were great, and my call to preach was verifiably confirmed in that experience. In 1859, my life began to change very dramatically. As I have said, by then my first wife had died. My oldest children were headed towards college or in college. And most momentously, in 1859, gold was discovered in Colorado. Now, 10 years earlier had been the California gold rush when they discovered gold in California. And now 10 years after that, gold was discovered in great quantities in Colorado. 1857, 2 years prior to that, there had been a massive financial crisis in the eastern part of the United States. And again, it left a lot of people broke. They lost their possessions, they lost their homes. Interest rates were like 12%. It was a very difficult time. And then 2 years later, gold was discovered, and there was another big gold rush to Colorado rather than California. And what was propelling a lot of people to go west to Colorado at that particular time was the promise of great riches. Stories were coming back from people who went out and happened to find a good vein of gold and became wealthy overnight. Others were going out and working in the newly developing hard rock mines that needed a lot of mining workers, and they were earning a good living. So hundreds, if not thousands of people, mostly men, came west to Colorado in order to raise a stake sufficient enough to go back home and take better care of their families. And so that kind of tugged at my heart. As I say, I was a lead miner. I knew all about that kind of mining. And I called to preach. Actually, the Lord kind of beat me over the head one day when I was down in a 30-foot prospect hole trying to find a vein of lead. And I was just feeling at so dis-ease in that moment. I said to the Lord, "Lord, what's wrong with me?" Well, the Lord knew the answer. I knew it too, but I didn't want to admit it. The answer was I was fighting His call on my life to become a preacher. And so in that 30-foot hole, I said, "Lord, I give up. Have it your way." Because the Lord knew I was so concerned about my family and my children's future. And He just seemed to say to me, "If you will follow me, I will take care of your family." And so I called up to the fellow at the top. He hauled me with bucket and shovel back up to the surface. I went home and talked to my brother, Robert, who was 2 years younger than I, and we'd grown up being very close to one another. I said, "Robert, God has called me to preach, and I feel now that I must go." And Robert, literally quoting the great David Crockett, said, "John, be sure you're right, and then go ahead." And so I did. And I began to preach first in Wisconsin and then in Minnesota. And as I say, by 1859, gold was discovered. And at that point, I began to have a problem with my vision. My eyes would close up overnight, and I'd have to use Sloan's Relief ointment every morning to wipe my eyes clear and pry them open, literally. I was convinced I was losing my eyesight. But what was happening in Colorado just pulled at my soul. So I determined in 1861 I wanted to go see Pikes Peak before I went blind. So I gathered up my good steed, my horse, all my earthly possessions, $14.75, and I struck out from Lenore, Minnesota, a town that I had founded where my family was living, and I headed out to Denver. I got as far as Newtown, Iowa, and stopped overnight, giving my horse a rest and myself one too. And my horse was put up in a stable where the owner of the stable had in that same stall with my horse a laying hen. He was concerned that my horse might disturb the hen or even step on her eggs, and so he moved my horse to a different stall where there was an open bin of grain. And my horse foundered. He ate so much, he nearly killed himself to death. So I was able to get him out down the road a little bit, but he wasn't serviceable any longer. So I had to sell him for a whopping $15, which was almost enough to cover the cost of my saddle and bridle. And from there, I walked from Newtown, Iowa to Omaha, Nebraska. And in Omaha, I was able to link up with a group of 18 wagons heading west. They agreed to carry my gear, such as it was, and I was to walk the rest of the distance from Omaha to Denver. Altogether, from Newtown to Denver, I walked about 800 miles, a distance that we covered in about 2 months. I was happy to get to Denver, but on the way, we stopped just south of Julesburg, about 75 miles south of Julesburg, and there was a newly constructed brick building there. And I was invited to come in and preach there. Well, I never turned down an opportunity to preach. That was my calling. That was what God wanted me to do. So we held a meeting. I preached. There was a good response. But afterwards, I heard people in my wagon train kind of snickering and making jokes. Turns out that that was a house of ill fame. Well, it didn't shock me too much because I knew that that's where people gathered. And the people who gathered in those kinds of places, houses of ill fame, bars, saloons, dance halls, were people in great need of Christian preaching. So even though it was a bit scandalous, I felt I was fulfilling my mission, my purpose, my calling to preach to such people in such places. We went on to Denver, and I met up with my second son, Elias, in Denver. He'd come out about a year ahead of me, and we had a nice reunion, and he knew where I wanted to go, and he pointed me to a little gold mine camp called Buckskin Joe. He said, "Dad, that's the most active gold mine camp in Colorado right now. They have found a rich strike of gold, so go there." It was another 100 miles beyond Denver, and I set out again on foot and got there a little after the 4th of July. I spent a week in Buckskin Joe and learned a lot of fascinating things about that little gold mining camp. It had been a camp of 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people. It was a little less than that by the time I got there. The gold finds were beginning to peter out, and they had just recently suffered a stroke of smallpox. It just rifled through the camp, and many miners up and left to get away from it. Others caught the disease. Some died of it. There was one dance hall girl in Buckskin Joe who went by the name of Silver Heels because the shoes that she danced in had silver heels. Now, she was a little different than the typical dance hall girl because she really cared for these miners. And as one after another got stricken with smallpox, she didn't run away from them. She nursed them. She nursed some of them back to health. She nursed some of them until, unfortunately, they passed away. But she gave her life, and she gave her health to doing that. Unfortunately, she caught smallpox herself, and it left terrible pockmarks all across her beautiful face. One day, the miners woke up, and Silver Heels was gone. They didn't know what happened to her. They didn't know where she went. She just disappeared. But years later, it was discovered that every year on a certain date, a mysterious woman would show up in Buckskin Joe and go to the cemetery there and visit the graves of the miners who had died during the smallpox epidemic. They didn't know who she was because she wore a very heavy black veil to disguise her face. So they were left to conjecture who this might have been. And it was agreed upon this must have been Silver Heels coming back to visit the miners for whom she had cared so much. I also met in Buckskin Joe one of the leading merchants of the day, H.B. Tabor. Now, Tabor had tried his hand at some prospecting, didn't have much success at it, but he quickly learned that the people who made the most money, other than the mine owners, the people who made the most money were the merchants who sold to miners the things that they needed: picks, shovels, panning, gold mining, big pans that you know what I mean. Anyway, and clothing, of course, and other kinds of supplies. And Tabor opened up a little shop in Buckskin Joe, and he made a lot of money. As Buckskin Joe began to decline in his mining activity, Tabor moved to Oro City, which later became known as Leadville, and he opened up a mercantile there as well. And one of the things that he would do when new prospectors would come to town, hoping to find a vein worth mining, he would grubstake them for a share in whatever they found. So there were two young men who came into his store one day looking for supplies, and he said, I will give all the supplies that you need for a 50% stake in whatever you find. They struck one of the biggest veins of silver in all of Leadville. And Tabor became fabulously wealthy. He was known as the Silver King of the West. He served as a senator from the new state of Colorado in Washington, D.C. He was Postmaster General. He owned an opera house in Leadville. He was a big personality. Unfortunately, he didn't spend his money wisely, and when the silver standard was obliterated by Congress in the late 1780s or 90s, he was broke overnight, and he died a pauper. I knew a lot of people like that, as they came out with great hopes to find riches, hopefully to make their families living better if they and when they returned back east. I want to kind of skip ahead here. There are so many stories I could tell you about my years in Colorado. I visited and preached in almost every gold mine camp there was, up and down the Rocky Mountains, on the Front Range, on the West Range, in some of the towns that were forming during that period of time. I had a few stationary appointments, although most of the time I was circuit riding. Now, when you think of a circuit rider, what's the other thing that you automatically think of? Pardon?
Horse.
A horse. Exactly. Well, here's the big piece of news to you. I didn't have a horse. I couldn't afford a horse. You couldn't live on what preachers made. And so I walked from appointment to appointment, preaching appointment to preaching appointment, all the time, almost all the time. And I think it's one of the things that actually helped build up my strength and my health. Because you see, even though I went to Colorado thinking I was going to become blind, I never did. I never did. I kept a good sight until the day I died. But during those years, there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of hardship. But the Lord kept confirming for me that I was where I was supposed to be, doing what He wanted me to do. Sometimes people wonder, well, how did you come by the name Father? Well, I must confess, when that first started being applied to me, I didn't like it. Remember, I had walked 800 miles from Newtown, Iowa, through Omaha, Nebraska, to Denver, to Buckskin Joe, and into my preaching appointments all around the mountainous area. And one day, I went down to Denver to attend a Sunday school convention at the Lawrenceburg Street Church, which became Trinity in downtown Denver. And I walked in as the children were having their session. And the host pastor saw me come in the back and he said, children, old Father Dyer has just arrived. And after we sing a song, he'll come up here and speak to you for a brief time. I thought to myself, old Father Dyer? I was in my mid-50s at that point. Not only had I walked from Newtown to Denver and Buckskin Joe to get to that meeting, I walked another 100 miles back from Buckskin Joe down to Denver. Now, there was a stage that carried passengers from Buckskin Joe down to Denver, but it was $10 fare one way. I didn't have $10 fare. I didn't have 20 for a round trip. So I did what I did the best. I walked. And I walked in after that 2 or 3 day journey on foot to be told I'm old. Well, when the children were done singing, I bounded up to the stage and I said, yes, children, here is OLDFATHERJOHNDYER, Old Father John Dyer. But, I said, and I just kind of poked the pastor, at least I don't wear a rug on my head and store-bought teeth tied in with a string in my mouth. Because that's what he did. Well, you might think that would have been the end of a friendship, but it wasn't. He took it in good stead. Eventually, I became accustomed to being called Father, because it spread, everybody started referring to me that way, and I began to realize it was an approbation they gave me out of respect and love. They appreciated my ministry, especially among the miners of Colorado. That pastor, by the way, spoke at my funeral years later. We've remained good friends. I started to tell you what we preached back in those days. We Methodists, of course, were great preachers. We believed in the gospel message. I always consider myself a true John Wesley Methodist preacher. And so I preached as all the Methodist preachers did in those days. All people need salvation. No one is accepted from that need. We are all in great need of salvation. And not only can we know that we are saved, we can be assured that we are saved. You see, there was at that time a growing theology across the West and in the United States that said, not once saved, always saved. You can lose your salvation. You can be saved and then turn away from the Lord, and He will reject you. You'll be in peril again. Or there was that theology that said, the Lord has selected a certain number of elect, and all the rest of you are lost forever. Nothing you can do about it. We Methodists didn't believe that. We believed that God's grace was sufficient for all, no exceptions. The only requirement was that we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior and turn our lives over to Him. If we would do that, we were adopted into God's family, and the Lord would never forsake us. Even if we had moments when we felt like forsaking Him, and maybe even sometimes did forsake Him. But we didn't lose our salvation. The Methodist class meeting leaders would come after us. They'd say, brother, sister, you're backsliding. You need to confess your sins and return to the Lord and get back in fellowship with your fellow believers in the class meetings. So very few people were allowed to slip away. They had to do it with real intention. And many did, but many others tried and then came back repentant. As I moved on farther west, I began to preach against the things that I believe were harmful to the people that I was called to minister to. Primarily gambling, drinking, and dancing. Now gambling, because these were hardworking miners. And when they got paid at the end of the week, they'd go into the camp or the town if there was one, and they'd go to the saloons, and they would begin to play cards, and oftentimes they would lose their whole paycheck. Card sharks would come in from other places who really knew how to play cards, where the miners mostly did not. And it was an easy win for them. They were abusing the hardworking miners that I had come to love so much. I preached against gambling. I preached against drinking because, in my experience, it was a horrendous way to treat one's body. This cup over here reminds me of the time when I was 5 years old, just 5 years old. And my father was laid up with rheumatism and was not able to harvest his flax. And so, as was often the case in those days, neighbors came alongside of him and helped him with the harvest. And whenever that happened, the host farmer would provide a flask of whiskey and a bucket of water to relieve the workers when they needed to take a break. Now, I must confess, even at 5 years old, I think I was born with a lust for whiskey, because every time I even saw it, my tongue began to water. So I decided, you know what? My dad wants me to take this flask of whiskey and this bucket of water out to the workers and administer to them. I'm going to take a tin cup, and I'm going to pour it half full of whiskey and half full of water, and I'm going to drink as much of it as I can before it stops tasting good. I don't know how much I drank. It wasn't more than a cup. But it began to strike me hard. I was trying to make my way back to the house, and I was so woozy, I collapsed in the field and flat on my back. I was looking up amongst the stalks of wheat, and they seemed like they were 7 feet tall, and the heads of the wheat looked like they were a foot tall. I passed out, and they had to carry me home. That was my first and last drunk. Shortly after that, my father took me to hear a temperance lecturer. They were quite popular back in those days. His message got through to me. At 5 years old, I took the pledge, and I never tasted a drop of whiskey again my whole life long. I saw what whiskey could do to people. And whiskey would make good miners dumbfounded men. It did not have a good effect on them. It caused them to make bad decisions. It caused them to act in rowdy ways that were detrimental to their own health or the health of others. And so I preached against whiskey, against all kinds of drinking. And the third thing I preached against was dancing. Now, dancing was a real problem in the mining camps because, for one thing, it was one of the very few recreational activities that could be had. And they had professional dance troupes going around to the camps, entertaining and engaging people in the dances. And even without them, dances were a popular relief, output of the tensions that were gathered up in the mining during the week. The problem with dancing is that there were very few women in the mining camps. You remember that most people came out to the west to mine gold, leaving their families behind because they wanted to raise a stake and go back and take better care of their families. But a few women did follow their husbands out to the mining camps. And there were other women who were kind of hangers-on. We called them soiled doves. They were the kind of women that you find in those houses of ill fame. They were very popular among some of the miners. And the dancing, of course, encouraged close physical contact, which led to some things that you didn't really want to happen. And more seriously, some of these miners' wives who were cooped up all week long in their makeshift cabins or even tents, some of them with children, when the weekend came and the dance floor was opened up, they were starving for some kind of social contact. So they would come and they would participate in the dances. Sometimes their husbands would stay at home with the children. Other times they brought the children to the dance. But what happened was there were a number of, we call them Lotharios, who habited these mining camp dances with the sole purpose of winning away from their husbands some of these miner wives. And they would fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. And they would pack up their things and run off with these Lotharios. And their only purpose was to take them away, use them, and then abandon them in some far-off place. Some of them never found their way back to their home, their camp. Some of them were so depressed and so ashamed of what had happened, they even committed suicide. So I preached against dancing. Gambling, drinking, and dancing. And I wasn't the only one who had those kinds of feelings. And one of my trips back to Breckenridge, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment, it was after I'd served the church 2 different times. And this particular visit back, one of my successors by the name of Florida Passmore was his name. And he was even more of a strict moralist than I was. And he had gone out on a limb and convinced the mayor, or I'm sorry, not the mayor, but convinced the sheriff that he really needed to enforce a law that was on the books in Colorado at that time that made it illegal for saloons to be open on the Sabbath. Well, certainly I would agree with that. But Brother Passmore took it to the nth degree, and he convinced the sheriff that it was his duty to close down all the saloons on the Sabbath day in Breckenridge. And they did. Well, of course, there was one group of people in town that weren't very happy with that decision. In fact, they were more than unhappy. They were spitting mad. And they decided to take revenge out against the pastor and the church that I had built, by sneaking in one night to the belfry. And they took a stick of dynamite and stuffed it up the bell of the church, lit it, ran away, and it blew the church bell to smithereens. So things were not always hunky-dory in the mining camps. There was real opposition. But it took a tenacious faith that would grab hold and never let go to represent the cause of Christ in the midst of all those kinds of circumstances and that kind of opposition. Well, as I say, I could tell you many, many stories like that, but I want to move ahead to a different part of my story, and I'll check to see how much time you have committed to me. Oh, my goodness. We're going to have to cover a lot of territory in about 3 minutes. I want to share with you the greatest lesson that I learned in the latter half of my time in Colorado. When I reached the age of 65, I was beginning to wear out. Walking all those miles and miles, preaching in all those difficult places. My health was beginning to decline. My strength was beginning to wane. So my spirit was crushed because I had, my middle son, Elias, who had come to Denver before I had, he ended up being a probate judge in Lake County. And he was presiding over a trial of a group of people who had been accused of murder. And these people's friends didn't want them to be tried. And so one day they came up to my son's courtroom in Granite, Colorado, and they murdered him. Just shot him dead cold in his own courtroom. And that crushed my spirit. Add to that, several years earlier during the Civil War, I lost another son who had been a prisoner at Andersonville Prison. And his ship bringing him back north to set him free was sunk in the Atlantic Ocean off North Carolina. All aboard perished. My other son, my third son, was also in the Civil War. He was wounded in his left foot and it had to be amputated above the ankle bone. And he was maimed for the rest of his life. Also about that time, I lost my third wife, Lucinda, who she and I had a wonderful marriage, a great relationship. We had no children together, but we were partners in ministry for many, many years. And we had moved down to Denver and she had just died. I needed to step aside and take a rest. So I applied for supernumerary status at a particular conference, and I was granted it. And for 2 years, I just kind of knocked around. In those days, there were no pensions for preachers. I had no income, and I just had to take up a skill called dowsing. I was able to use the dowsing tool and hopefully find places that might have good veins of gold or silver. I did some of that, but I was just kind of scraping by. Finally, 2 years later, I went back to the conference and said, I think I'm fit to serve again. And so they brought me back into full-time service. And they sent me to Breckenridge, to Summit County Charge. Now, Summit County, about 10 years after this, was divided up into 5 different counties in the Colorado Territory. So you can imagine how large a territory I was assigned to preach the gospel. I did it. I gave it my best. I spent a year in Breckenridge. We built the first church on the western slope, but it was tough going. And after that, I went back to conference and said, I need to retire. So I took superannuated status, which is retirement. And at that point, Lucinda and I moved up into the mountains where I had staked out a claim for a gold mine, the Warriors Mark Mine near Boreas Pass. And we spent 2 winters up there. But after the second winter, we both decided, we're too old for this. We can't stand this weather. Cold, windy, isolated. So at that point, we left Warriors Mark and moved down into Denver. Within a week after we moved, Lucinda died. I was a widow again, knocking around, not knowing what to do. So I found myself going back up to Breckenridge for a second time. And when I got there this time, they had no pastor. The conference didn't have anyone to send. So I told them, well, send me. I'll stay here until the next conference when you're able to send someone else. And so they agreed, and I was at Breckenridge not for another year, but for another 3 years before they were able to send somebody. And at the end of those 3 years, I really was ready to hang it up. And I became fully retired at the age of 68. In the conference of 1885, I took superannuated status. In 1888, we moved to Denver. Lucenta died. I was at 76 at that point. In 1889, I went back to Breckenridge and preached a wide-ranging circuit among all the gold mines in that area. I was retired, but I was back full-time preaching and walking from gold mine camp to gold mine camp in the worst of conditions. In 1890, I preached what I thought would be my farewell sermon at that annual conference. It wasn't the last that I attended, but I thought it might be. I was getting that old. And after that, I retired to the town of Bailey in Colorado. And Bailey was actually founded by my sister and her husband, Ann and William Bailey. And our other sister, Elizabeth Enterkin, had come and had decided to settle there as well. And so I hung up my coat for a while, and I sat in the rocking chair on the porch of Elizabeth's cabin. She actually had a lodge that she ran, and oh, that feels good. So I was sitting there on her cabin porch, and a lot of people came there for the weekend or extended stays, and it was kind of a little hotel. And I visited with everybody who came through. One of the people that I visited with came to be known later on in his life as the Dean of Reporters for the Denver Post. He and I had struck up a good relationship. At any rate, I spent some amount of time just taking it easy. I certainly had earned it. And then, wouldn't you know, they found gold in Cripple Creek at a place where everybody who knew anything about gold mining said, there's no gold here. Most people didn't even bother looking. But this one guy who was kind of known as a Looney Tune around there kept looking for gold, and he found the richest gold find in the state of Colorado. Well, gold mine always had a pull on me. Preaching to miners had an even greater pull on me. So what do you think I did? Oh. By this time, I was walking on 2 canes because of my rheumatism. But my son Samuel and I went to Cripple Creek. I was the first preacher to preach in Cripple Creek. I used my dowsing stick and found what I thought would be a good gold place, gold mine. It turned out not to be, but we tried our best to make it work. Anyway, after making a go of it in Cripple Creek, getting fired up again preaching to the miners, I went back to Breckenridge for a 3rd time. And by this time, Reverend Passmore had, done his thing, and the church had been blown up, the belfry had been blown up. But I just couldn't get Breckenridge out of my blood. It was a hard place to serve, as I've told you. But it kept calling me back. And finally, let me get my years straight here. My memory's 212 years old, so it didn't always work the way it used to. But at any rate, in 1894, a friend of mine was taking me in his buggy across South Park. The horses bolted and threw me out of the wagon. And I was quite seriously injured. They had to take me to the nearest house, who put me up for a long time until I recovered. But that was the only annual conference that I missed in all the 40 years that I served and lived in Colorado. And I wrote a letter to that conference, apologizing for not being able to be there, but explaining to them what had happened. And they had already heard about my serious accident. And so they, in brotherly love, I'm sure, they passed a resolution. I want to read it to you. It gives you an idea of how serious my injury was. But in the journal at the Rocky Mountain Conference for that year, this is what they recorded. Whereas it has been reported to this conference that one venerable father in Christ, Reverend J.L. Dyer, that's me, has received a serious accident which we fear will permanently disable him and deprive us of future fellowship with him in the recurring sessions of the Colorado Annual Conference. Therefore, be it resolved that we assure Father Dyer of our heartfelt sympathy and prayers. We assure him that at this session, his vacant place is filled by all his brethren. At future sessions, his memory will be cherished inspiration. And when at last our beloved Snow Shoe Itinerant has passed up the mountain path into the gates of pearl, we who remain will rejoice in his life and try so to live as to tell him when we meet him in heaven that his faithful pioneer labors in Colorado have not been in vain in the Lord. Does that sound to you the way it sounded to me? They didn't expect to see me ever again at annual conference. Well, they didn't expect that. But the next year, 1895, I answered the roll call. I answered it again in 1895, and 1896, and 1897, and 1898, and 1899. Whoops. You see, the thing I learned through all this, and it was a lesson that was hard to learn, but the Lord taught me, never quit until the Lord has used you up. Never quit until the Lord has used you up. I've told you, there were many times across my life when I was ready to quit, and sometimes when I did quit. But the Lord kept pulling me back. He wasn't done with me yet. My last annual conference was in Salida, Colorado, in the year 1900. That following October 14th, 1900, I answered an invitation to come preach in the Sunday morning service at the Cameron Memorial Methodist Church in South Denver. It was a cold, blustery October day, and I caught a cold on the way out and back that was hard for me to shake. That winter was difficult on my health, and by the time spring came around in 1901, I was on the deathbed by the beginning of June. The whole state took great interest in my progress, or lack thereof. Every day carried an update in the newspapers all across the state of how Father Dyer was getting along. Finally, on June the 16th, 1901, the Lord called me home. He had finally used me up, and I am so grateful that he did. Thank you. Thank you very much. At this point, I step out of character. I'm just regular with Don Cummings now. And if you'd like to ask any questions about Father Dyer, the history of the state of Colorado, the meaning of the universe, whatever you want to ask. What would you like to know? Yes?
How many shoes did you do?
Well, I left out, and I meant to include it, but I left out the most important story about shoes. Because in the early going, the first year or so that I was in Buckskin Joe, preachers didn't make any money to speak of. The conference mandated salary was like $200 for the whole year. So I had to look for other means of income. And I had the opportunity to take the mail contract to deliver mail between Buckskin Joe and Leadville. The problem was it had to be over the wintertime and over Mosquito Pass. Now, Mosquito Pass is one of the highest passes in Colorado, 13,188 feet to be exact. And going over that in the wintertime was almost impossible. But in my day, we had something that we called Norwegian snowshoes. not the kind of web snowshoes that you think of, but these were narrow pine boards usually, 9 to 11 or 12 feet long. And you strapped your shoe onto the mid part of that snowshoe with a leather strap, and you bent the tip ends up so they wouldn't catch the snow every time you moved forward. And that was how I was able to get across Mosquito Pass. The problem with that, though, was you couldn't do it during the daytime because the sun would soften the snow and you'd sink right down into it. The tips of your skis would just collect it, and it would be almost impossible to make progress. So I waited until about 2 o'clock in the morning when the sun was down, it really was cold in the mountains, and a new crust had formed over the surface of the snow, and it was easier to glide across Mosquito Pass under those conditions. And I would start at like about 2 o'clock in the morning and be able to reach Leadville by the next day and deliver the mail. And I did that twice a week for the whole winter. It was a good income. Probably the best income I had the whole time I was in Colorado. So that's my shoe story. Yes?
I've been to Breckenridge. I believe they have the snowshoes at the church inside on the wall. Is that true?
They have one.
Okay.
Yes, I don't know where the other one is. Well, wait, they may have two. I used to be able to use one of those kinds of snowshoes when I did my show in Buena Vista at the Heritage Museum, because they had one. Now, just recently, there was an article in the Fair Play Flume, the local newspaper, of someone who had a connection with a family to whom Elizabeth Interken, when they broke up her cabin, had given them a pair of these Norwegian snowshoes. And they believed they were John Dyer snowshoes. The provenance is not certain. You can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But the likelihood is pretty strong that these may have been his snowshoes. And they're going to be in the Park County History Museum, if not already. So, it's quite a time. In modern days, we started a ski hall of fame in Colorado. John Dyer either was the first or one of the first inductees into the Ski Hall of Fame. Somebody over here? You all look highly intelligent, like you already know everything you need to know. Anybody over here?
Here we go.
Yes.
Does the phrase Kentucky Chautauqua ring any bell with?
I'm sorry, Kentucky what?
Kentucky Chautauqua.
Chautauqua. Yes, that's another part of my story we didn't have time to get to today. But Cane Ridge happened in 1801, 11 years before I was born. And its influence was still being felt very strongly all across the Western frontier and elsewhere. As you know, the first Great Awakening was during John Wesley's lifetime. But by the time, at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, the fervor of the Great Awakening had died down. And so there was a great need for a new sweeping revival by the time the 1800s were born. And that spark happened at Cane Ridge. Now, I was never at Cane Ridge, but as I referred to a couple times in my story, my early story, my father exposed us to camp meeting style religion. The same kind of fervor that was evident at Cane Ridge. And I used that same model in a lot of my preaching meetings in Colorado. So yes, that's, of course, Kentucky Chautauqua actually came about after the fervor of the Second Great Awakening, as the supposed excesses of spiritual expressions, the jerking, the shouting, the falling down dead, those, eventually became unacceptable to polite society. And so the fervent camp meeting movement of that era kind of morphed into Kentucky Chautauqua and other Chautauqua places around the country, like in New York and in Ohio, and they became respectable. They still had a spiritual emphasis, but not always the passion. I was going to sing for you some of the hymns that we sang in my meetings, because that period of time was a fertile period of time for hymnody. And I'm going to get my time machine open here for just a second. You will have one of these. It's a great time machine. And I have in here a list of the most popular hymns that were written in the period 1860 to 1870. You'll recognize most of these. Beneath the cross of Jesus, 1862, there's a wideness in God's mercy, and he leadeth me, he leadeth me. 1863, ring the bells of heaven, revive us again, da 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 da. And in 1864, my Jesus, I love thee, and shall we gather at the river, and for the beauty of the earth, and I will sing the mercies of the Lord. 1865, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. And in 1868, pass me not, O gentle Savior, and in the sweet by and by. I missed 1867, onward Christian soldiers, marching as to war. And 1869, Jesus keep me near the cross. Now, I will confess to you, I did not have the greatest singing voice. My singing voice was not nearly as strong as my preaching voice. But whether I sang or preached, I did so with great passion. And I believe it's passion that wins people's souls for the Lord. So, that was a freebie. Don't expect me to ever sing again. Okay, any other questions? Well, let me say it's been a delight to be here today. Thank you. Whenever we talk to folks about Wesley Village, we say, well, half of our friends are already here, and the other half are headed here. So we may see you again soon. Alan, thank you.
I just need to repeat, never quit till the Lord uses us up. That deserves an amen. That is a tenacious faith in a topsy-turvy world what we need today. Thank you, Father Dyer, and thank you, Don Cummings, for coming our way today. My pleasure. Thank each one of you. You may have some more questions. Come on up and express your gratitude. We'll do this again someday soon. Follow your pink sheets for other events in October. You're all most welcome. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Don Cummings. We appreciate it so much.